Ireland, 2012. Part 1. Whispers in the Dark. It was late afternoon, and the fading light of the Irish sun cast long shadows over the narrow streets of Cork. Clara Donovan sat quietly on the edge of her worn, floral-patterned couch, her fingers clutching the fabric as if the threads held the answers to the impossible questions swirling in her mind. The house was too still, almost suffocatingly silent, with only the sound of the ticking clock echoing through the room. Her gaze, tired and anxious, rested on her daughter Emily, who sat on the floor just a few feet away. At 8 years old, Emily had once been the light of Claire's life, a joyful, vibrant child who filled their modest home with laughter and warmth. But that light had long since dimmed, replaced by an unsettling darkness that now seemed to follow Emily wherever she went. Claire couldn't pinpoint the exact moment it all began, but the change had been swift and terrifying. It was as if overnight, her daughter had become a stranger. Emily sat cross-legged on the floor, her small frame hunched forward, staring blankly at the space before her. The room felt colder than it should have for a summer evening, and though the windows were closed, Claire could swear she felt a draft, a chill that didn't belong. Emily's once lively blue eyes, now dull and hollow, seemed fixed on something only she could see. Her pale skin looked almost translucent in the dim light, and the rosy glow of childhood had long since drained from her face, leaving her with an unnerving pallor. "Emily," Claire called softly, though the girl didn't respond. Claire's voice cracked under the weight of fear, and she hated how small it sounded in the empty room. "Sweetheart, are you hungry? I can make your favorite spaghetti, remember?" Still, Emily didn't move. It was as though her daughter had forgotten how to exist in the world around her. The sight broke Claire's heart into pieces too small to mend. She had tried everything: doctors, therapists, medications that promised relief but only seemed to make things worse. The psychiatrist told her that Emily's violent outbursts were likely the result of trauma, though they couldn't explain what kind of trauma could have caused such a drastic transformation in a child so young. Claire had racked her brain for answers, desperate to understand what had happened to her sweet girl, but every explanation seemed to slip through her fingers like sand. Claire's mind wandered back to the beginning, to when the nightmares had first started. Emily had woken up screaming in the dead of night, her voice filled with terror as she pointed at something in the corner of her room. Something invisible to everyone but her. "He's watching me, Mom," Emily had sobbed, her tiny body trembling in Claire's arms. "He's always watching." At first, Claire dismissed it as a child's overactive imagination, the kind of thing that would pass with time and reassurance. But the nightmares didn't go away. In fact, they grew worse. Emily's once peaceful nights became battlegrounds of terror, filled with guttural screams and frantic whispers in languages Claire had never heard before. There were moments when Emily would thrash so violently in her sleep that Claire had to hold her down, afraid she would hurt herself. Then came the waking hours, when Emily began speaking in strange, disjointed sentences, her eyes flickering with a dark intensity that sent chills down Claire's spine. The once bright child who had filled their home with love and laughter was slowly slipping away, and Claire felt powerless to stop it. She had tried so hard to hold on to the Emily she knew, but with each passing day, the gap between them seemed to grow wider, until it felt like she was living with a stranger who wore her daughter's face, but carried something far darker within her. Claire's thoughts were interrupted by a soft, almost inaudible sound, Emily's voice. At first, Claire thought she had imagined it, the whisper so faint it barely stirred the air. But then she heard it again, clearer this time. "He's here," Emily murmured, her voice hollow, distant. Claire's heart dropped, her breath catching in her throat. She glanced around the room, her eyes darting to the darkened corners, but there was nothing. No one. Only the eerie stillness of the house and the encroaching shadows as the day slipped into evening. "Who's here, darling?" Claire asked, her voice trembling as she forced herself to approach Emily. She knelt beside her daughter, placing a gentle hand on her small shoulder, though the touch felt foreign, as if Emily were made of ice. For a moment, Emily didn't respond. Her eyes remained fixed on the space in front of her, unblinking. But then, slowly, she turned her head to look at Claire. And what Claire saw in her daughter's eyes chilled her to the core. There was nothing, no recognition, no warmth, no love, only darkness. It was as if Emily were staring through her, as though Claire were nothing more than a shadow, irrelevant and unseen. Without warning, Emily's hand shot out, grabbing a nearby vase off the coffee table with a force that was far beyond her small frame. Before Claire could react, Emily hurled it across the room, the delicate porcelain shattering against the wall with a deafening crash. The sound echoed through the house, and for a brief moment, everything was still. Claire stumbled backward in shock, her heart racing. "Emily," she cried out, but her voice barely registered in the thick air. Her daughter didn't flinch, didn't move, as if the destruction she had just caused meant nothing to her. Desperation clawed at Claire's chest as she reached for Emily again, pulling her into a tight embrace. "Sweetheart, please," she whispered, her voice breaking. "What's happening to you?" Emily's body was stiff in her arms, cold and unyielding, like a statue. And then, in that same guttural voice Claire had heard in the dead of night, Emily whispered something unintelligible, an ancient, sinister language that twisted through the air like a dark melody. Claire's blood ran cold. Tears welled in her eyes, panic rising like a tidal wave inside her. She was losing her daughter, and she didn't know how to stop it. No doctor, no therapist had been able to help. The last few months had been a blur of endless appointments, tests, and empty reassurances. But now, watching Emily speak in a language she couldn't understand, Claire knew deep down that this was no ordinary illness. This was something far more terrifying, something far beyond her control. Her mind raced, searching for anything, any memory, any story that might offer a lifeline. And then, like a distant echo, she remembered a conversation she had overheard in the town market months ago. A woman had been talking about a man, Pastor Declan. He wasn't like the other priests in town. Quiet, unassuming, and deeply devout. Declan was said to have dealt with matters that others feared to speak of. Matters like this. Claire had dismissed the rumors at the time, clinging to logic and science. But now, as she held her trembling daughter in her arms, the idea of something darker, something unholy, didn't seem so far-fetched. She had no other options. Claire lifted Emily into her arms, her hands shaking as she carried her daughter up the stairs and into her bedroom. Emily remained motionless, her breathing shallow and uneven. Claire laid her down gently on the bed, brushing a strand of hair away from Emily's pale face. "I'll find help," Claire whispered, though she wasn't sure if the words were for Emily or for herself. "I'll find someone who can fix this." As she left the room, closing the door behind her, Claire's mind was made up. She would go to Pastor Declan. She would beg for his help, for his guidance. Anything that could bring her daughter back from the darkness that had swallowed her whole. Part 2. A fractured faith. The sun had barely risen when Claire found herself standing in front of St. Bridget's, the old stone church nestled on the outskirts of Cork. It loomed large against the pale morning sky, its towering spire disappearing into the low-hanging mist that clung to the earth. The cold, gray light of dawn seemed to seep into her bones as she stood there, hesitant, her heart pounding in her chest. The weight of what she was about to do felt almost too much to bear. Claire had never been a particularly religious woman. She had attended Mass on occasion, especially during Easter and Christmas, but her faith had always been more of a quiet comfort than a guiding force in her life. But now, faith was all she had left. It was all she could cling to in the face of the darkness that had descended upon her daughter. She took a deep breath and pushed open the heavy wooden doors. The church was empty, its silence broken only by the faint echo of her footsteps as she walked down the aisle. The scent of incense still lingered in the air from the evening Mass, and the dim light from the stained glass windows cast multicolored shadows on the stone floor. It was a place of peace, of sanctuary. Yet to Claire it felt like a place of last resort. As she reached the small office at the back of the church, she knocked softly on the door, her heart racing with anticipation. After what felt like an eternity, the door creaked open, revealing Pastor Declan. Declan was a man of quiet presence, with graying hair that curled slightly at the edges and deep-set, piercing eyes that seemed to see more than what was in front of him. He was known throughout Cork as a man of unwavering faith, a pillar in the community who, despite his unassuming demeanor, had been involved in events that many whispered about but rarely spoke of openly. He had seen things that no one else dared confront. "Claire," he said softly, his voice carrying the warmth of someone who had been expecting her, though she hadn't sent word. His eyes moved to the weariness on her face, the desperation etched in her features. "I've been praying for you." His words, so simple yet so profound, sent a wave of emotion crashing over her. Claire bit back the tears that threatened to spill as she stepped into the small, dimly lit office. The room was modest, lined with shelves filled with worn Bibles and religious texts. A simple wooden cross hung on the wall above a small desk scattered with papers and a candle, its flame flickering gently in the stillness. Declan motioned for her to sit, and Claire did so, her hands clasped tightly in her lap as she struggled to find the right words. How could she explain the horrors she had witnessed? How could she make someone believe that her daughter, her sweet, innocent Emily, was being tormented by something far beyond the physical realm? "I don't know where to begin," Claire said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't even know if you'll believe me." Declan leaned forward, his gaze steady and kind. "You've come seeking help, Claire. Tell me what troubles you, and we will face it together." Claire swallowed hard, then began to speak. She told him everything about the nightmares, the violent outbursts, the chilling whispers in the night. She spoke of the vase that had shattered against the wall and the hollow emptiness in Emily's eyes that had once been so full of life. And as she spoke, Declan listened in silence, his face grave but never once showing disbelief. When she had finished, the silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. Claire's heart pounded in her chest as she waited for his response, afraid that even he, with his reputation for handling the supernatural, might turn her away. But Declan didn't. Instead, he sighed deeply, his eyes clouding with concern. "I've seen this before," he said quietly, his voice measured, as if each word held weight. "Not often, but enough to know what you're dealing with. This is not something of the natural world, Claire. It is spiritual, dark forces at work." The words hung in the air like a heavy fog, wrapping around Claire and pulling her deeper into the reality she had been so afraid to face. She had suspected as much, had felt it in the pit of her stomach, but hearing it spoken aloud by someone like Declan made it all the more real. Claire's breath hitched as she looked into his eyes, searching for something, anything that would offer her hope. "Can you help her?" she asked, her voice trembling with fear and uncertainty. "Can you save my daughter?" Declan didn't answer immediately. Instead, he rose from his chair and walked over to the window, staring out at the church grounds as though lost in thought. The morning mist still lingered, and the world outside seemed as still and quiet as the sanctuary they stood in. Finally, he spoke, his back still turned to her. "Claire, the road ahead will not be easy. What you've described is more than just possession. It is a torment. The evil that clings to your daughter seeks to destroy her, and it will resist every effort to remove it." His words sent a chill down Claire's spine. She had hoped for something simpler, something less terrifying. But Declan's voice carried the weight of experience, of a man who had seen and fought these battles before. He turned to face her, his expression serious but not without compassion. "I will help you, but you must understand that this is not a fight I can win alone. You too must prepare yourself. The power of prayer is strong, but only if it comes from a place of unwavering faith. This spirit will do everything it can to break you, to break your connection to God. You must not allow it." Claire nodded, though fear gripped her heart. She had never been the kind of person to lean on prayer. Her faith had always been personal, quiet, not something she wielded in battle. But now, it seemed, she had no choice. Declan walked back to his desk, picking up the Bible that had clearly seen better days. The edges of the pages were worn from use, and the cover was cracked from years of being opened and closed in moments of desperation. He held it out to her. "Take this," he said, his voice firm. "Read it. Pray over Emily every night. Pray for protection, for strength, for guidance. I will be fasting and praying for the next 3 days. I need time to prepare for what's coming. Evil does not give up easily, and I must be ready to face it." Claire took the Bible, her fingers trembling as they brushed against the worn leather cover. It felt heavy in her hands, not just in weight, but in significance. She had never truly understood the power of these pages, but now she was beginning to grasp their importance. 3 days, Declan repeated, his eyes locking with hers. "In 3 days' time, I will come to your home, and we will begin. But until then, you must stay strong. Keep your faith, no matter what happens." Claire stood, the enormity of what lay ahead pressing down on her shoulders like a weight she wasn't sure she could carry. But as she looked at Declan, his unwavering faith, his quiet confidence, she felt a spark of hope flicker in the darkness. "Thank you," she whispered, though the words felt inadequate for the gratitude she felt. "Thank you for not turning us away." Declan gave her a small, reassuring smile. "We are never truly alone in these battles, Claire. God walks with us, even in the darkest of times. Have faith in that, and we will see this through." Claire nodded, clutching the Bible to her chest as she left the office, stepping back into the vast emptiness of the church. The weight of the world still pressed down on her, but there was something else now, a glimmer of light, a faint but steady pulse of hope that told her she was not walking this path alone. As she pushed open the doors and stepped out into the cold morning air, the mist seemed to part, just for a moment, as if offering her a glimpse of the way forward. The battle was only just beginning, but Claire knew now that she would fight with every ounce of strength she had, because Emily was worth it. And with Declan's help, she prayed that this darkness would not have the final word. Part 3. The Storm Within. 3 days had passed, but to Claire, it felt like an eternity. The ticking of the clock became a haunting reminder of time slipping through her fingers as she waited for Pastor Declan's arrival. Outside, the sky had grown ominously dark, with heavy clouds rolling in, threatening an impending storm. The wind howled against the windows of her small, modest home, as if nature itself was bracing for what was to come. Inside, the atmosphere was even more unsettling. Claire sat at the edge of Emily's bed, her heart racing as she looked down at her daughter. Emily lay motionless, her body curled under the blankets, eyes closed but her brow furrowed in restless discomfort. The air in the room felt thick, oppressive, like an invisible weight pressing down on everything. The only sound was the low hum of the wind outside, but to Claire, it felt as if the very house itself was holding its breath, waiting. Emily had not spoken since that day, since she had thrown the vase and whispered in that unholy voice. She had been eerily silent, not just in her words, but in her presence. There was something deeply wrong, and Claire could feel it in her bones. It was as though Emily wasn't truly there anymore, that something else had taken her place, something far more sinister and terrifying. The warmth and innocence that once radiated from her child was gone, replaced by a cold emptiness that chilled Claire to her core. "Stay with me, Emily," Claire whispered, brushing a strand of hair from her daughter's pale forehead. Her hand trembled as she touched Emily's skin. It was cold, unnaturally so, as if all the life had drained out of her. "Please stay with me." But Emily didn't stir. Her breathing was shallow, her body still. Claire's mind raced with the horrors of what could come. She had read the Bible every night as Declan instructed, praying over Emily with every ounce of faith she could muster. But there were moments when doubt crept in, moments when the silence in the house was so deafening that it felt like God himself had turned away. A sudden knock at the door broke the stillness, causing Claire to jump. Her heart leapt to her throat as she hurried downstairs, the sound of the wind growing louder as she approached the door. When she opened it, Pastor Declan stood there, framed by the gathering storm. His coat flapped in the wind, and the rain had just begun to fall, dotting the ground in slow, heavy drops. He stepped inside without a word, closing the door behind him and immediately removing his coat, revealing the worn Bible he carried under his arm. "Is she ready?" Declan asked, his voice calm but filled with an intensity that made Claire's heart race even faster. Claire nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She led him up the narrow staircase, the creaking of the wooden steps only adding to the tension that filled the house. As they reached Emily's room, the air grew colder still, and the oppressive atmosphere seemed to close in around them. Declan paused at the door, closing his eyes and murmuring a quiet prayer under his breath before stepping inside. The room, already darkened by the storm outside, felt suffocating, as if the very walls were closing in on them. Emily remained motionless on the bed, her small figure barely rising and falling with each shallow breath. Declan's expression hardened as he looked at her. "I need you to pray with me, Claire," he said, his voice low but commanding. "This will not be an easy battle." Claire nodded again, though fear gripped her heart. She had never felt more afraid in her life. Her fingers trembled as she clutched the Bible Declan had given her days earlier, and together they knelt at Emily's bedside. Declan began to pray, his voice steady and authoritative, but the words seemed to hang in the air, as if meeting resistance from something unseen. Suddenly, Emily's body convulsed. Her eyes flew open, and a guttural growl escaped her lips, so low, so inhuman that Claire recoiled in terror. Emily's limbs jerked violently, her small body thrashing against the bed as if something inside her was fighting to break free. Claire gasped, her hands shaking as she tried to hold Emily down, but the strength in her daughter's tiny frame was overwhelming, far beyond what was natural. "She's too strong," Claire cried, her voice trembling as she struggled to keep Emily from hurting herself. "How is this possible?" Declan's face remained calm, but his voice grew louder, more forceful. "In the name of Jesus Christ, I command you to leave this child." His words rang out with authority, but Emily's body only seemed to convulse harder, her back arching off the bed in a way that made Claire's stomach churn. The storm outside had grown fiercer, lightning flashing in the sky, followed by the deafening roar of thunder. Inside the room, the spiritual storm mirrored the chaos outside. The very air seemed to throb with tension, vibrating with unseen forces clashing around them. Claire's heart pounded in her chest as she watched Emily writhe, her face contorted in pain, her eyes rolling back in her head. Declan did not waver. His voice, though calm, grew more powerful with each command. "By the blood of Christ, I cast you out." He raised his hand, clutching the cross that hung around his neck. "Leave this innocent child and return to the darkness from which you came." Emily's body fell still for a moment, as if the force inside her was pausing, gathering strength. And then, without warning, her head snapped toward Declan, her eyes, once Emily's bright blue eyes, were now pitch black, reflecting nothing but emptiness. A voice that did not belong to an 8-year-old girl came from her lips, cold and mocking. "She's mine," it hissed, the words dripping with malice. "You cannot save her." Claire's blood ran cold. She had never believed in such things before, but now, faced with this terrifying reality, there was no denying it. Something evil, something dark had taken hold of her daughter, and it wasn't going to let go without a fight. Declan's expression remained resolute, though Claire could see the strain in his face, the weight of the battle pressing down on him. He held his Bible in one hand, the cross in the other, and began to recite verses from the book of Psalms, his voice unwavering even as Emily's body convulsed violently on the bed. The wind outside howled louder, the windows rattling in their frames as the storm raged on. Claire knelt beside her daughter, tears streaming down her face as she whispered prayers through sobs. She had never felt more helpless, watching as the girl she had raised, the child she had loved so fiercely, was torn apart by something beyond her understanding. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the room fell eerily silent. Emily's body went limp, her chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. The blackness in her eyes faded, replaced by the dull blue of exhaustion. Declan lowered his hands, his face pale but determined. "It's not over," he said quietly, his voice hoarse from hours of prayer. This spirit is strong. It won't let go easily. But we're not done. We will fight." Claire looked down at Emily, her heart aching. Her daughter's face was pale, her skin clammy to the touch, but there was something fragile yet real, flickering in her eyes. Hope. It was faint, but it was there. And that small glimmer of light, that tiny piece of the Emily she knew and loved, was enough to give Claire the strength she needed to continue. "We will fight," Claire whispered, her voice trembling but resolute. "We will fight." Part 4. The Eye of the Tempest. The night descended heavily upon Cork, bringing with it a storm that felt almost apocalyptic. The wind howled like a distant wail of despair, rattling the windows of Claire's house with relentless fury. Outside, the rain lashed against the walls, and flashes of lightning illuminated the darkened sky, each burst of light momentarily revealing the chaos unfolding within the home. But even as nature unleashed its fury, what was happening inside Emily's bedroom felt far more terrifying, far more intense than anything the storm could conjure. The air in the room was thick with tension, an oppressive force that pressed down on Claire and Pastor Declan like an invisible weight. It felt as though the walls themselves were closing in, suffocating them with the sheer malevolence of the presence that lingered in the room. Emily lay on the bed, her small body eerily still, but the sense of dread that hung over her was palpable. She was no longer just a little girl trapped in a nightmare. She was the battleground for something far darker, something that sought to claim her soul. Declan stood at the foot of the bed, his Bible open in one hand, his other hand gripping the wooden cross around his neck. His face was pale, his brow slick with sweat, but his resolve remained unshaken. He had been in this battle for hours, and though exhaustion gnawed at his bones, he knew they could not stop. They were nearing the breaking point, the moment when the darkness would either consume or be driven out. Claire knelt beside Emily, clutching her daughter's hand, though the skin beneath her touch felt clammy and cold. Her heart pounded in her chest as she whispered prayers, her voice trembling but unrelenting. She was terrified, more than she had ever been in her entire life. But she refused to let go. She refused to abandon Emily. Even as the child she once knew seemed to slip further and further away. For a moment, there was an eerie stillness in the room. The wind outside seemed to die down, the rain softening into a mere whisper. Claire could feel her pulse in her throat, the tension stretching like a taut wire, ready to snap at any second. Then Emily stirred. Her small body, which had lain so still, so lifeless, began to tremble. At first, it was barely noticeable, a slight twitch in her fingers, the faintest movement beneath her closed eyelids. But then the tremors grew stronger, more violent. Her eyes shot open, but they were not Emily's eyes. They were black, void of any light, and filled with a cold, terrifying malice that seemed to suck the warmth out of the room. Claire gasped, recoiling in horror as her daughter's mouth twisted into a grotesque smile. The voice that came from Emily's lips was not her own. It was guttural, low, and laced with venom. "She's gone," the voice hissed, the sound of it sending a shiver down Claire's spine. "You will never have her back. She belongs to us now." "No," Claire choked out, shaking her head in disbelief. Tears welled in her eyes, blurring her vision as she clung to Emily's hand. "No, you're lying. My daughter is still here." Emily's body jerked violently, her limbs flailing as if something was trying to break free from within her. Claire tried to hold her down, but the force was too strong, far stronger than any 8-year-old child could possibly muster. It was as if something far darker, far more powerful, had taken control of her. Declan stepped forward, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "In the name of Jesus Christ, I command you to leave this child." His words were firm, resolute, each one dripping with the authority of his faith. He raised the cross above his head, his voice rising in prayer, calling upon the power of God to cast out the evil that had taken hold of Emily. The entity within Emily let out a low, guttural laugh, a sound so unnatural, so filled with malice, that it made Claire's blood run cold. "You think you can save her?" it taunted, its voice dripping with contempt. "She is mine. She has always been mine." The lights in the room flickered violently, as if the very house was reacting to the malevolent presence within it. The wind outside picked up once again, howling like a banshee as the storm raged on. Lightning flashed, illuminating Emily's twisted face for a brief moment. Her eyes locked on Declan with a hatred so intense it felt like the air was burning. But Declan did not waver. He stepped closer to the bed, his face a mask of determination. "By the blood of Christ, I rebuke you," he said, his voice rising with each word. "You have no power here. This child belongs to God, and in his name, I command you to release her." Emily's body convulsed violently, her back arching off the bed in a way that made Claire's stomach churn. The voice that came from her was no longer taunting. It was furious, a snarling, growling sound that echoed off the walls. "You cannot win," it spat, Emily's small frame twisting and contorting with unnatural strength. "She will be lost. You will all be lost," Claire sobbed, gripping Emily's hand tighter, her heart breaking at the sight of her daughter's suffering. "Please, God," she whispered through her tears. "Please bring her back to me. Don't let her go." Suddenly, Emily let out a piercing scream, a sound so loud and so filled with agony that it reverberated through the house, shaking the very foundation. Claire clamped her hands over her ears, her eyes wide with terror as Emily's body thrashed against the bed, the sheets twisting and tangling around her like shackles. The temperature in the room dropped sharply, and Claire could see her breath hanging in the air in front of her, each exhale a puff of white mist. It felt as though the room itself had become a battleground between heaven and hell, the forces of good and evil colliding in a war that neither Claire nor Declan could fully comprehend. But Declan pressed on. His voice rose above the chaos, a beacon of light in the darkness. "By the power of the Holy Spirit, I command you to leave this child now." His voice was steady, unwavering, even as Emily's screams grew louder, more desperate. The entity within Emily howled in rage, her body thrashing so violently that Claire feared she would break. But just when it seemed as though the darkness would never release its hold, there was a shift, a faint flicker of light that pierced through the blackness. Emily's body fell still. For a moment, everything was quiet. The storm outside seemed to calm, the wind dying down to a mere whisper. The air in the room, once thick with tension, felt lighter, as though a great weight had been lifted. Claire's heart pounded in her chest as she stared down at her daughter, her breath catching in her throat. "Emily," she whispered, her voice trembling with hope. For what felt like an eternity, there was no response. Emily's chest rose and fell in shallow, ragged breaths, but she did not move. Claire's hands shook as she reached out, gently brushing a strand of hair from her daughter's face. Then, slowly, Emily's eyes fluttered open. They were no longer black and hollow, no longer the eyes of something unholy. Instead, they were soft, tired, and unmistakably hers. "Mom?" Emily's voice was small, weak, but it was her voice, her real voice. Claire's breath caught in her throat, and for a moment, she couldn't speak. Tears streamed down her face as she pulled Emily into her arms, holding her as tightly as she dared. "I'm here, sweetheart," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm here." Emily's body was limp in her arms, but there was no more thrashing, no more convulsing. The darkness had been driven out, leaving behind only the fragile, broken girl that Claire loved so deeply. She kissed the top of Emily's head, her heart swelling with a mixture of relief and gratitude so overwhelming it brought her to her knees. Pastor Declan stood at the foot of the bed, his face pale but calm. His hands were trembling, his body visibly exhausted from the hours of battle, but there was a quiet sense of peace in his eyes. "It's over," he said softly, though his voice was laced with exhaustion. "The darkness has been cast out." Claire could barely speak through her tears. She looked at Declan, her heart bursting with gratitude, though no words felt adequate enough to express it. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice shaking. "Thank you for saving her." But Declan shook his head, his expression serious. "It wasn't me, Claire. It was the power of God. His light is what saved your daughter." Outside, the storm finally began to wane, the wind dying down to a soft breeze as the rain tapered off into a gentle drizzle. The house, once filled with darkness and despair, now felt lighter, brighter. Claire held Emily close, her heart filled with a peace she hadn't felt in months. Emily was safe. Part 5, Dawn of Deliverance. The storm had passed, leaving Cork bathed in the pale light of dawn. The sky, now calm and clear, stretched across the town like a fresh canvas after the violent tempest of the previous night. The streets were wet, shimmering with the remnants of rain, and a cool breeze carried with it the scent of earth renewed. Birds sang hesitantly, as if testing the peace that had returned to the world. Inside St. Bridget's Church, the atmosphere was markedly different from the turmoil of Emily's room just hours before. The church's stone walls, though old and weathered, seemed to glow in the soft light streaming through the stained glass windows, casting a mosaic of colors across the pews. It was here, within these sacred walls, that Claire had brought Emily, now resting in her arms, her body still weak from the battle she had endured. Claire sat in one of the front pews, her hands wrapped tightly around Emily's small frame as the child slept peacefully for the first time in weeks. Her heart, though still heavy with the weight of the ordeal, was finally beginning to mend. There were no more shadows in Emily's face, no more signs of the darkness that had once taken hold of her. Instead, there was only the soft rise and fall of her chest as she breathed, each exhale a reminder that her daughter had been returned to her. Pastor Declan stood at the altar, his eyes closed in silent prayer. He too looked exhausted, his face pale, his shoulders slumped, but there was a quiet strength in him that had not faltered, not even during the darkest moments of the night. His hands rested on the Bible that had been his weapon throughout the battle, its worn pages now marked with the prayers that had called forth the power of God to save Emily. The church was empty except for them, the usual morning hustle of Cork's townspeople not yet begun. It was a moment of quiet, a sanctuary in time, where the horrors of the night seemed far away, like the fading memory of a bad dream. Claire's fingers brushed Emily's cheek, her touch gentle, as if afraid that any sudden movement might wake her daughter from the peace she had found. The weight of the last few months pressed down on Claire's shoulders, but for the first time, in what felt like an eternity, it was a burden she could bear. The fear, the doubt, the helplessness that had consumed her, they were gone, swept away like the storm outside. She looked up at Declan, her voice quiet but steady. "Is it really over?" Declan opened his eyes, meeting her gaze. His face was solemn, but there was a glimmer of hope in his expression. "The darkness has been driven out," he said, his voice firm, "but the road ahead will still require vigilance. The enemy never gives up easily." Claire nodded, understanding the weight of his words. She had seen the power of evil up close, felt its suffocating grip on her daughter. But she had also seen the power of faith, the strength that came from calling upon something greater than herself. And now, in the calm after the storm, she knew that this was a victory not just for Emily, but for her as well. "I'll keep praying," Claire said, her voice trembling slightly but filled with newfound resolve. "I'll keep praying for her." Declan nodded, his expression softening. "Prayer is the strongest weapon we have, and now that the darkness has been cast out, Emily will need your love, your faith, to heal completely." As if on cue, Emily stirred in Claire's arms, her eyes fluttering open. For a brief moment, Claire held her breath, the memory of those black, hollow eyes flashing in her mind. But when Emily looked up at her mother, her eyes were bright, clear, and filled with confusion, but no fear. "Mom?" Emily's voice was soft, tentative. She blinked, her brows furrowing as she looked around the church, clearly unsure of where she was or how she had gotten there. What happened? Claire's breath hitched in her throat, tears springing to her eyes. She smiled, brushing a lock of Emily's hair behind her ear. "You're safe now, sweetheart," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You're safe." Emily's small hand reached up to touch her mother's face, her fingers brushing away the tears that had begun to fall. "I don't remember," she said quietly, her voice filled with the innocence that had been lost to her for so long. "I feel different." Claire kissed the top of her daughter's head, holding her close. "You're okay now," she said, her heart swelling with gratitude. "That's all that matters." For a long time, they sat there in silence, the peace of the morning wrapping around them like a protective blanket. Claire could feel the presence of God in the church, in the warmth of the light that filtered through the stained glass windows, in the steady, reassuring hum of life returning to normal. It was as if the very air had been cleansed, purged of the darkness that had once hung over them like a suffocating cloud. Finally, after what felt like hours but was only minutes, Emily looked up at her mother with a quiet curiosity. "Mom, was it a bad dream?" Claire hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to answer. How could she explain what had happened, what Emily had been through, without terrifying her? How could she make sense of something that still seemed so unreal, even to her? "It felt like a dream, didn't it?" Claire said softly, stroking Emily's hair. "But it's over now. You're safe, and you're home." Emily nodded, though the confusion in her eyes lingered. "I don't remember everything," she murmured, "but I felt lost, like I was trapped in the dark." Claire's heart clenched at the words. She hugged Emily tighter, as if holding her close could erase the memories of the darkness that had tried to claim her. "You're not lost anymore," she whispered. "You're here, and you're never going back there again." Declan approached them then, his presence a quiet reassurance. He knelt beside the pew, his eyes kind as he looked at Emily. "You're a very brave girl, Emily," he said gently. "You fought hard, and now you're free." Emily looked up at him, her eyes wide and curious. "Who are you?" Declan smiled softly. "I'm just a friend, someone who helped your mom keep you safe." Emily's eyes flicked between her mother and Declan, a small frown forming on her face. "Was there something bad inside me?" Claire's breath caught in her throat, but Declan responded before she could. "There was something trying to hurt you," he said carefully, his voice gentle but firm. "But it's gone now. It can't hurt you anymore." Emily seemed to consider his words for a moment before nodding slowly. "Good," she said simply, her small body relaxing into her mother's embrace. "I'm glad it's gone." Claire closed her eyes, a single tear slipping down her cheek. She had her daughter back. The darkness was gone, banished by the power of faith and prayer. And though the road ahead might still hold challenges, she knew now that they would face them together. Pastor Declan rose to his feet, his expression filled with quiet satisfaction. "Claire," he said softly, his eyes meeting hers, "the town will hear of this. Your strength, your faith. It will be an inspiration to many." Claire shook her head, still overwhelmed by the events of the last few days. "I didn't do anything special," she said quietly, looking down at Emily's peaceful face. I just prayed." Declan smiled, his eyes filled with the wisdom of someone who had seen the power of prayer work miracles. "Sometimes that's all it takes," he said. "Faith as small as a mustard seed can move mountains." Claire nodded, her heart swelling with gratitude once again. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." Declan gave a small nod of acknowledgement before turning to leave. As he reached the door of the church, he paused, looking back at Claire and Emily one last time. "God's light shines brightest in the darkness," he said softly. "Never forget that." With those words, he stepped out into the morning light, leaving behind the echoes of a battle hard fought and won. As Claire sat there in the quiet of the church, holding Emily close, she felt the weight of everything that had happened, everything they had endured, lift from her shoulders. The future, once so uncertain, now seemed brighter, filled with the promise of hope, of healing, of love. Emily shifted in her arms, her small voice breaking the silence. "Mom? Yes, sweetheart? Can we go home?" Claire smiled, pressing a kiss to Emily's forehead. "Yes, darling. Let's go home." And with that, they rose from the pew, hand in hand, ready to step back into the world that awaited them. The battle had been won, and though the scars of the past would always remain, they would face the future together, with faith, with hope, and with the unshakable knowledge that no darkness could ever extinguish the light of love. If this story moved you, please leave a comment below to share your thoughts and experiences. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, God bless you.